Welcome everybody to Go Local Live. I'm Josh Fenton. It is the 4 o'clock hour. We probably have one of the most timely guests going on. Top journalist, long-standing career, been everywhere, done everything, interviewed everybody from George Bush to O.J. Simpson, so I think he's covered it all. Joe Strupp's just come out with a major book. I think it captures exactly what many people in politics, news, business are talking about. It's called Killing Journalism. Joe, welcome to Go Local Live. Thanks so much for joining us today by Skype.
Yes, thanks for having me. Good to be here. I appreciate the time you're giving.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk a little about what motivated you to do this book.
Yeah, well, here's the book, Killing Journalism. And the full long, I know some recently the Star-Ledger gave me a good review. The Star-Ledger, the paper in New Jersey, my home state, gave it a nice review, and they called the title, I think, a bit too long. It's Killing Journalism, How Greed, Laziness, and Donald Trump Are Destroying News and How We Can Save It. So there's a lot of people to blame, Trump among them, but he's not the only culprit. Many of the culprits are in the industry themselves, who have been cutting back, who've been going for the easy story, who've been going for the non-investigative effort to really, get clickbait, get viewers, get readers, to the exclusion of real journalism. Not all of them. A lot of great journalism is still being done. I just think it's a lot less, and it's a lot more difficult to do. And I've been covering media and news for about 18 years, and I have been collecting a lot of information over the years on what's really wrong with journalism. And then when people start to say, well, it's all liberal, it's all left-wing, and then, of course, now the president and others saying fake news. And there is some fake news out there, but it's not what he thinks it is. It's not CNN. It's not the New York Times. It's not the mainstream traditional credible sites and news outlets. It's a lot of the fake news sites themselves, the WorldNet Dailies, the InfoWars, Daily Caller to a degree, and some on the left as well, but many of them seem to be conservative-based. And they're the ones really doing the poor reporting, and I wanted to get the word out to people of what the real problem with news is. It's not that it's fake news, it's that there's less money being spent, there's cutbacks in staff, a lot fewer reporters, a lot fewer editors. There's also less money for defending reporters and paying for legal challenges to dig up news. A lot of areas that most people don't even realize.
Joe, let me break this down into two things, because I think they're a little bit mutually exclusive. Let me break these down. I think one is presidents, especially this president, having battles with the media. Let's push that one off for a couple of minutes. Let's talk about the business of journalism. Listen, we launched Go Local in 2010. When we launched, the Providence Journal was owned by Belo. It's sold since then over to Gatehouse. When we launched, it had a much smaller newsroom than it used to have. It only had 120 people in the newsroom in 2010. It now has approximately 15 news reporters. These cuts and slashes were well into motion well before Donald Trump gave up The Apprentice. So let's talk about this, especially in local news, right? It's kind of two different worlds. National and global seem to be doing okay. CNN, the New York Times, ABC News, and then local, mid-city markets and local. Talk a little bit about what's going on in local markets around the country.
Right, and a lot of newspapers are closing or cutting back. I live in New Jersey, which, again, as I mentioned, the Star-Ledger is the major paper here.
Right.
For many years, it was what we would call fat and happy.
Yeah.
It was making lots of money for Advance Media, which owns them, and several other papers, and also owns many magazines in a lot of areas. But they had really successful big newspapers, big news staffs. Our Trenton Bureau for the Star-Ledger and the Record, which was the other paper that's now owned by Gannett, they had big coverage of state and local news and regional news. They don't have that anymore.
Right.
They don't cover small towns like they used to. They come to my town and others in New Jersey when there's a big fire or a murder or some eye-grabbing story, but they're not covering the city councils. They're not covering the school boards. They're not covering the regional water district and these other places that take your money and spend it and that should be reported on, and also are the place where you count on for clean water, for good schools, for clean air, for transportation. New Jersey is a major transportation issue. Lots of people commute into New York City every day. I'm sure up where you are, there's plenty of Providence transit going on, Boston area, lots of areas not being covered. because the local and state coverage is not being done. And weekly papers are doing a lot less than they used to. In many places, that's the only outlet for journalism. And then there are creation of what we call these news deserts, areas across the country. The Columbia Journalism Review has done big stories on this, as has the Poynter Institute. These areas that have really no regular news coverage, no radio, not even weekly papers in some areas. So they count on Facebook or Twitter and what people put there as alleged news or rumor or claims.
Well,
a lot of limited coverage where there used to be a lot more.
I think in these deserts, you're going to see the greatest period of small-town corruption maybe in the history of American democracy. Let me give you one anecdote. So when you do your second printing of this book, you can throw it in. The Providence Journal. Yeah, the Providence Journal had a office back in the day, 1989, 1990, in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, small city.
Sure.
You know, I think it's the fourth largest city in Rhode Island, which means it's really small.
Home of the Pawtucket Red Sox, I believe.
Yes, absolutely. And they had an office with 9 reporters and 2 editors. And of those 9 reporters, 3 of them went on to win Pulitzer Prizes. Dean Starkman, who then later went to the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times. He wrote for us for a bit. Helene Cooper, who's now at the New York Times.
Oh, right, I know her in the New York Times.
And Dan Barry at the New York Times.
Dan Barry, who now lives in New Jersey, not far from me.
So,
and writes for the New York Times. I didn't know they all had that connection. That's
yeah,
great.
They were all in the same little newsroom out in a branch, you know, in the kind of in the middle of nowhere. And that goes to show you what the influence, the depth, the quality of newspapers had 25, 30 years ago. Now you're talking about the newsroom at the Providence Journal can't match that for statewide news. Let's talk a little bit about, you know, we're seeing these companies just gobbling up newsrooms and newspapers. Gatehouse just bought a group, I think, out in Indiana, and then a couple days later they laid off 60 people across the country. Obviously, everybody's talking about Digital First, who's owned by a major hedge fund.
Yes.
They're trying to make a move on Gannett, owners of USA Today, and some other major newspapers. Listen, these companies are finding some way to strip mine these newspapers, sell off assets, sell off real estate, and make money. And in capitalism, heck, that's the way railroads got built and lots of other things got built. You know, those in the media and maybe even those of us, those in politics and in other sectors complain about this, but isn't it fair game? Isn't, you know, these things are for profit and people want to make money off these things. They've always been businesses for the most part.
Right, and I actually talk in my book at the end about nonprofit news, which I think is one of the answers, not the only answer.
Right.
A lot of nonprofit news sites have come about in the last 5-10 years. There's almost 200 of them. ProPublica in New York is probably the most well-known. Up by you have the New England Center for Investigative Reporting.
Sure.
There's similar outlets in California. But yes, news outlets are for profit. But in the old days, it seemed to be when there were more family-owned or smaller companies, the profit margin was less. The many family-owned papers, you mentioned Belo that owned the Providence Journal. I worked for them in California at the Press Enterprise in Riverside,
sure,
which had been owned for a long time by a local family. Belo bought them, treated them pretty well as far as newspaper companies go. But then they were sold again to another company, as was the Journal, and many of these outlets. They're getting sold to these larger companies that are borrowing, leveraging their assets to make the purchase. They need higher profits, both to pay off what they owe on the debts and also to help their shareholders. So you're getting up to 20, 25% profit demands at a time when news outlets are facing more competition, facing big ad revenue competition. A lot of this coincides with the internet coming in and stealing a lot of advertising. Google and Facebook now account for a majority of online and general advertising, and they don't really even cover news.
Right.
So that's one of the problems that deals with having, yes, they're for profit, but the profit demand is larger, and this is also, you know, really a public service. I write in the book about how journalism and news is the only real profession given constitutional protection.
Yeah.
We're right there in the First Amendment along with the religion and freedom of speech. So it seems to be a need to be treated a little differently, but they are businesses, and sometimes the profit and the almost desperate attempt to make money when there is so much more competition and so much more technology, that anything goes as long as it can raise the revenue, raise the audience, and make more money, even at the expense of the quality. You talk about small newspapers. I did start at a small newspaper in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which was owned by Media News, which is now Digital First. So I also have that connection. But yeah, a lot of the small papers are where people started and where they got their feet wet, and a lot of those aren't around anymore either.
Let's talk a little bit about the nonprofit, or these, and in some cases they're vanity plays by millionaires and billionaires. DNA Info was one. I was on a panel, I don't know, 6-7 years ago with Patch and DNA Info and a couple others. And DNA Info, they were in New York, Chicago. I think they own the Gothamist too. And billionaire Ricketts owned them, funded them. They never made any significant revenue. And one day the newsroom decides to unionize. Ricketts, who's the head of TD Ameritech, decides to close them the day they vote to unionize. And I don't remember what the total number was, 100, 150 journalists out of work in a day. I worry a little bit about the nonprofit model because, one, doesn't build much innovation, and number two is generally, in the case of ProPublica, in the case of Texas Tribune, there's usually a very significant interest, a billionaire behind it, which creates its own conflicts, doesn't it?
Well, I think in a lot of the ones you're mentioning, Texas Tribune has big money, ProPublica, a lot of the others, there's things like Inside Climate News, which has won a Pulitzer. Several of them have won awards and do good work. There's some in San Diego. One of the ones I highlighted in my book is The Lens in New Orleans, which has done a lot of award-winning work. And they also work with mainstream outlets. A lot of them have worked with the New York Times, with the Wall Street Journal, with public broadcasting. And I think they definitely weed out the poor imitators among those that are really trying to do some work. And since they are nonprofit, they are not seeking revenue to the point where they have to make a profit. Now, yeah, you can slant news and you can have biased coverage, but those aren't the ones that are going to be winning awards or getting attention. They're going to be kind of pushed aside, I think, after a while when people realize what's behind them, whether it's left or right-leaning. I think many of them are trying to do and fill this void in a way that can work with the current news outlets and other places. And it's not the entire answer. Personally, my view would be all news would be a nonprofit because they could focus on the quality of the product and not worry about making money. But we know that's not going to happen.
Well, but I'd push back. I'd push back on that a little bit. We certainly haven't seen that in healthcare, where the majority of American healthcare is nonprofit. In this market, small market, million people live here. The CEO of one of the hospital groups makes $2.8 million. So, the tax status is not necessarily a great indicator of always the perfection of the public spirit. Let's go over. I sent you a little clip from Art Buchwald talking about Richard Nixon in 1972 or 1973. Chiding Nixon's complaints against the media. Certainly Donald Trump has taken it to the extreme of criticizing the media, and in part he can because he has Twitter and tens of millions of followers, so he can be unfiltered and be able to talk directly to those who are interested in what he has to say. But this rhythm between massive frustration at different times between presidents or other elected officials, governors as well, and the media is not new to democracy in the United States.
No, every president has had its war with the press, including Obama. A lot of people forget the Obama administration was not a great friend to the press. Obama didn't go on Twitter and rip into them like Trump. He didn't call them fake news and urge the public to attack them or call them enemy of the people. But in the administration, they did a lot to counter the press. They were one of the most secretive administrations in terms of getting information out.
Right.
They were, for a while, Obama started a war with Fox News, didn't want them to be allowed in the press briefings or called on. That got a lot of backlash from many of the rivals of Fox, who generally unite together and say, look, you've got to treat us all like professionals. Fox, CNN, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, that's one of the things about the White House correspondents in general. They work together to get that access.
Right.
But Obama, he wanted his secrecy, as did Clinton, as did both Bushes. That's what they do. I interviewed one of the former White House Correspondents Association presidents once, Steve Toma, who is now I believe the News Editors Association director. He covered the White House for McClatchy for many years. He once told me every White House seeks to be more secretive than the one before. It's just the way it is today. But in Trump's case, he has Twitter. He also has a celebrity television image and sort of a unique approach, unlike anyone. Can you imagine if Richard Nixon had Twitter back in the day?
Oh, we can only imagine, right?
Continuously, as might someone like Bill Clinton or any of the presidents at the time. But in those cases, I think with Nixon, even Lyndon Johnson, obviously, didn't like a lot of things about the press, and now Trump, generally what's reported about them is factual, and they just don't want it to be reported. And in Trump's case, he takes that to another level where he basically says, you know what, you can't believe them, believe me. And he doesn't really give any reason why. He doesn't give any proof that any of this is fake or that things are not true. He just claims it. And when you have a president who lies as much as he does, as bad as Nixon might have been with the press and with telling the truth in many cases, he didn't seem to spout as many lies as Trump, although several that were very large lies led to him leaving office. But in Trump's case, he really does take that direct approach, that clear attack that's really baseless, and that does a lot of damage, not only to the press who he's going after because people will believe the president, but also to Trump's own image. And it kind of creates this cycle of when do you believe him, when do you fact check him, and when can the public trust what he says and also trust what the press says because he's saying so many negative things about them.
Isn't a Trump, though, require the press to absolutely double down on making sure stories are correct? We saw a recent case of the interaction between a Catholic school, high school kid and a Native American at a demonstration. The media got the story wrong. I think yesterday the young man's family filed a $250 million.
Yes, they're suing the Washington Post, which seems to be a very misguided lawsuit, but it'll be interesting how it unfolds.
Well, it's certainly, clearly a number of journalists apologized once they saw other versions of the interaction from other video perspectives. There's some criticism of the media on what's going on with the star of the show Power and his claims of being racially attacked for racial reasons.
The young man from Empire.
Yeah, Empire. Sorry, not Power. Empire. Because of Trump's ability to communicate with people and his maybe not always completely dependent on the facts, as you point out, but relentless criticism of the media, doesn't it really require the media to slow down sometimes and make sure they get it right? CNN had a story of, a year ago, proved to be incorrect. They dismissed, I believe, the news director and a number of other folks. Some of these and in previous administrations, maybe they wouldn't be so exposed and be picked up quite so publicly. Isn't it really a requirement of the media for its own effectiveness to double down and make sure that they fact check?
Yes, and I think a lot of that has happened since Trump got in. We've seen more investigative reporting, more in-depth coverage. I think that's a positive.
Absolutely.
And the other interesting thing we're seeing is that there's a lot of news outlets who are succeeding because of Trump. The New York Times has shown revenue and readership is up. A lot of the cable channels have seen increases in viewership. A lot more reporting is being done on in-depth studies and in-depth sources. As far as the Catholic school kerfuffle with the Native American gentleman, and then there was another group that was involved that was not initially reported, which I think is one of the things you're pointing to, and that's true. They jumped to conclusions too quickly. A lot of it has to do with a lot of the video that was first seen was not the complete story. I even tweeted at the time and wrote on my blog, my website, strupblog.net, that they jumped to conclusions too quickly.
Yeah.
And that's never good. Now, does it deserve a $250 million lawsuit? Probably not. But is it another sign of misguided reporting and jumping to conclusions? Yes. I have several chapters in the book on breaking news and over-coverage and jumping to the facts before they're all known. And that was a perfect example of it. The gentleman from Empire who claimed he was attacked both as a hate crime against him being gay and also being African American. I do recall early on in that coverage, there was some, I thought CNN and another outlet the day after did make sure to report that police were saying there was no video of the event, there were no witnesses, and they were still looking for more verification. And some people said, well, why didn't they question him right away? Well, that's a tricky subject, I think. When you're talking about racial issues, you're talking about hate crimes, you don't want to immediately say that something was made up or fake when you don't know. It did seem a little strange to me and a lot of people, I think, because he claimed the person had a Make America Great hat and that they put a noose around his neck. Those are things that aren't generally done in these kinds of hate crimes in urban areas, and there were no witnesses. There was some skepticism, I think, even early on. Not everyone saw those reports because not everyone sees everything. People also start to claim things on Facebook, on Twitter, that they believe occurred or that they say was done in the reporting when it wasn't necessarily. And as soon as the police came out and said, we're not sure about this, even before the two young men were brought forth who allegedly were hired by him to commit the crime, I think the media was pretty quick to update. And again, people who want to go after the media will find reasons to go after them. There are examples of news outlets making mistakes, but I think there are a lot more examples of them doing the right thing, doing the right reporting, and correcting it more often than Trump or a lot of the far-right false news outlets will ever do.
Joe,
and you're not going to have perfection. These are human beings, and it's also part of the fact that we do have fewer people. And that's one of the things you're going to have that's a real problem. Resources are cut, fewer people are doing the job, and there's less journalism to be done when there are fewer people on the job, and more mistakes are going to be made. That's true.
Joe, you make a good point about the New York Times, their growth, especially on the digital subscription side. There probably hasn't been a front page in the last 2 years of the New York Times that did not have Donald Trump above the fold. Is their business in peril if Mike Pence becomes president of the United States?
I think the New York Times is going to be in good shape as long as they're covering the news the way they're supposed to. They've definitely gotten a boost from Trump. As a lot of news outlets have.
One of the things you talk about in your book is some solutions. Let's finish up with some of the solutions that you see as potential ways of saving media in the United States.
Well, I think keeping a look at the nonprofit outlets, helping them to do what they're supposed to, keep the donations coming, get creative on new ones. And I think a lot of it's up to the public to support the true mainstream and honest journalism. There's niche publications that do a great job. There are outlets that just cover certain areas, just cover criminal justice, just cover education, local. Support the news outlet in your area, whether it's online, whether it's in print, whether it's on TV or on Sirius satellite radio or wherever it is. Support the ones that are doing a good job. Don't support the ones that are false and fake. Look into the fact-checking. There's a lot of great fact-checking that goes on. PolitiFact is one of them, factcheck.org. Snopes.com is one of my favorites. They're a website that will review rumors online, and we all know there's plenty of rumors and lies that go out online. And you know, the website is the web is a real hard bell to unring once something is spread around. So it's good to fact check these things constantly. I'm sure you see it as well. I see people put things on Facebook or Twitter. Hey, look at this story. I can't believe this is happening. Whatever it is, I'll do a quick check, see if it's real or not. And a lot of the time, it's a false story, a fake story. And it's not a fake news story from CNN or the New York Times or even Fox. Sometimes it's from some website you never heard of or some person creating it. I think it's really up to the public to subscribe to your papers, to put the money into these locations that are doing the good work, to demand corrections, and to also fact check when the president and others make claims that aren't true. Another thing you mentioned about this case involving the Catholic school student who's suing, this also comes a day after Clarence Thomas made a comment that he thought libel laws should be revisited. The Sullivan case, which basically set the current libel situation from 1964, the Sullivan case that was the New York Times related to a Montgomery, Alabama ad that was put in. That
Bull Connors, wasn't it?
Yes, the ad made false claims about Montgomery police treatment of Martin Luther King, but the findings in the Supreme Court were that it was not with malice. And that's a real key element to libel, as you know, that you have to have that malice intent for something to be considered libelous. Clarence Thomas just said the other day he would like to see that revisited. And I know Trump would like to see libel laws revisited. That would be a very dangerous thing if we made it easier to file lawsuits against press outlets for things that aren't really worth it. In my book, I talk about the Gawker case. Gawker.com was sued by the wrestler Hulk Hogan, and it ended up driving them out of business. But it turned out a lot of it was based on money that Hogan had supporting him, and that made Gawker deplete their funds to the point where they couldn't even appeal the case that they might well have won an appeal, and now they're out of business. If we see that with other news outlets, it's going to be very scary. And I also talk about in the book the impact on funds and money to set aside for legal defense of news outlets is much lower. Libel cases are much more on the rise, according to many of the legal experts I talk to. And there's less money to defend reporters when they're trying to gain access to things like public documents and public records. And the Freedom of Information Act request backlog at the federal government is immense. Some of the requests for information going back more than a decade.
Yeah.
And so all of that plays into this, and it's very serious matter.
We know it well. We sued the governor of the state of Rhode Island a couple of years ago over documents tied to an investigation to one of the biggest business failures, Kurt Schilling's 38 Studios and state police interviews. And it was lengthy and it was expensive, and ultimately she surrendered the information we were seeking. But it's a lot of time and energy and money. It's real money.
Yes, and that's something that a lot of news outlets don't want to deal with because they don't have the time or the money to put into it. And also a lot of outlets are sometimes hesitant to go after investigative stories if their protection is lessened, if they're more likely to face something like a lawsuit, a libel suit or slander suit, or even invasion of privacy, which was what the Gawker case was about.
Right.
And it makes them reluctant to try to take on a lot of these issues. And then a lot of news doesn't get covered the way it should.
Listen, Joe, congratulations on the book. We'll have a story up tomorrow with links and where you can buy it on Amazon and all the rest. But we'd love to have the opportunity to check in with you from time to time in the future. You're becoming one of the leading experts on sort of where media is and what the future is. Your jacket endorsements on your book is about as good as you get in journalism today. So kudos to you and the respect of your peers that you've earned over your career and with this book. Anything else, people, that I didn't ask you about that people should know?
No, I just think people should look. The book obviously has Donald Trump on the cover, and he's part of the title, but it's not. Most of it is not about Trump. Most of it is about related issues, from legal defense and some of the things we talked about to just the way some of the press is overcovering some news, undercovering some news, looking for the quick breaking story that's often wrong, and also trying to find other areas where we can improve coverage. But I think that's where it is. Also, yes, as you said, it's on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. Ask your local bookstore to order it if you want to get a copy there. And a lot of information on this and other things are on my website, joestrupp.com, and I'm also on Twitter at Joe Strupp. So my views and comments are everywhere, even if you didn't want to hear them. So thank you very much, and I'd love to come back. I appreciate the great work you guys are doing. It sounds like real in-depth stuff.
Yeah, we'd love to, and if you're up in New England, we'd love to have you over in studio or maybe do a little dinner or something like that with you. I'll be in touch on that. Joe Strupp, thanks so much. Congratulations on the book. Well-timed, great title, and I think a very, very smart book with a lot of good insights. We welcome you on and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much. Be well.
Everybody, thanks so much for tuning in today in a special edition here on Wednesday, following up after Laura Afonso's amazing show with Lobster Paella. Can't beat that. Tomorrow we'll be back with Chelsea Gay and Kate Nagel in the 3 and the 4 o'clock hours. We will not be at the State House this week live because they're out on legislative recess. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you, and look for some new breaking news on an announcement by the governor's office that's going out now. Thanks, everybody.